Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Bill 148 is Here, Are You Ready? I am Monina Fabria, the Decent Work Project Lead for ONN. If you're new to the ONN, we are the provincial network for Ontario's 55,000 nonprofits and charities, and we will work to help strengthen the nonprofit sector by engaging and advocating with and for nonprofits and charities in communities across the province. But first, the technical stuff. Our webinar should last an hour. If you experience any technical difficulties during that time, we recommend closing your web browser and reopening it. If you miss anything, just know that we will email all registrants following this webinar, which will include the relevant information and webinar recording. So please keep an eye out for that email early next week. We've got a lot of people joining us today on this webinar, so we are going to mute participant lines to reduce the noise disruptions. And with lots of information to get through, we will also be closing the questions function of this webinar. However, if you have questions following today's presentation, please feel free to email us at bill148@theonn.ca. As part of our work on Bill 148, a frequently asked questions page has been developed, and details about where to find our FAQ, how to access the slide deck, and the next webinar date will be available at the end of this presentation. You'll see on the handout side of your dashboard and GoToWebinar, the presentation slides are now available. Lastly, we'd like to thank United Way of Toronto and York Region for supporting ONN in our Bill 148 education. So just to highlight a little bit about the Ontario nonprofit sector, as I mentioned, the Ontario nonprofit landscape is represented by approximately 55,000 nonprofit organizations with a workforce of over 1 million workers, including part-time and full-time in that number. So issues like Bill 148 is definitely something that is affecting our sector. At ONN, our mission is a strong, resilient nonprofit sector, thriving communities, a dynamic province. And our vision is to engage, advocate, and lead with and for nonprofit and charitable organizations that work for the public benefit in Ontario. And we hope that opportunities like today's webinar, which is impacting many of you, will help build the strength of the nonprofit sector. So this is just an overview of our hour and what Rebecca will be covering. But before we delve into that, I just wanted to highlight a little bit about what we're talking about today. So please note that this is in no way an exhaustive list or complete list of the changes to the Employment Standards Act or your rights or obligations under the ESA or any other law in Ontario. This presentation is legal information relevant to Ontario, and it is not to be used as legal advice. The content in this presentation is accurate as of January 26, 2018, and if you're reading or watching this webinar after the 26th, it may not be legally accurate. There are links to resources in this presentation that are believed to be legally accurate, but we do not guarantee that the information is accurate, timely, or complete. Should you have any questions about your rights or obligations under the Employment Standards Act or any other law, we recommend that you seek legal advice. So I'd like to pass it off to my co-host, Rebecca, to get us underway. Rebecca currently works as a lawyer for the Community Legal Education of Ontario, CLEO, and as the director of Centennial College's Legal Information Centre. Prior to this, Rebecca spent 4 years working in labor, employment, and human rights law for a downtown firm. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Monina, and thank you everyone for taking some time today to join us for this really important webinar. So before I get into the changes brought about by Bill 148, it's very important that everyone on the line understands what the Employment Standards Act is and why it's important to employers. So the Employment Standards Act applies to most nonprofit sector employers and employees in Ontario. So it's important that you understand your obligations as employers under the ESA. As I mentioned, it applies to most employees and employers, but there are a few industries and jobs with exemptions or special rules, and you can click on that link right there. And it will list all the industries and jobs that are exempted or have special rules applied to them under the Employment Standards Act. Some examples of this include secondary school students working in co-op programs authorized by their school board, post-secondary students working in cooperative or work experience programs approved by their college or university. So note that not all students are exempted from the ESA, but students that fall into one of those two categories are. Politicians, judges, religious officials, and others are also exempt from the ESA. And again, you can click on that link of industries and jobs with exemptions or special rules. But these exemptions and rules are actually currently under review, so they could be changing quite soon. So the Employment Standards Act sets out the minimum standards for employees in Ontario. This means that as employers, you must meet this minimum standard. You can't contract out of your obligations in the ESA. However, you may have policies or employment contracts that give employees a greater benefit than what's in the ESA, and this is fine. But this is a fact-specific analysis and will really depend on what exactly you are offering in comparison to what you are obligated to provide under the ESA. And we're going to revisit this concept of the greater benefit rule when we discuss personal emergency leave later on. So if you have questions about whether or not you're offering a greater benefit than what you are obligated to offer under the ESA, it's really important that you seek legal advice, as it is a fact-specific analysis. Lastly, the ESA includes part-time, full-time, casual, and that includes non-fixed hours, contract, seasonal, and home workers when defining employees. So this is a really important concept to grasp. So the way the ESA defines employees, it applies that term employees to workers who have very different employment statuses. So unless an employee is explicitly exempted from the ESA, as we reviewed previously, or explicitly treated differently under one of its provisions, when an ESA entitlement states that it applies to employees, it is referring to the definition of employee under the ESA, which applies to many different types of employment statuses. So now moving on to Bill 148. After a 2-year process and review of the ESA, Ontario introduced this piece of legislation to amend the ESA and the Labour Relations Act. Bill 148 received royal assent November 27, 2017, and some changes apply to your workplaces now, and others will come into effect later. This presentation will not be covering every change to the ESA, and we will also not be covering any changes to the Labour Relations Act. If you have unionized workers, some of the Bill 148 amendments to the ESA have or will come into force in your workplace, regardless of your collective agreement provisions. But other changes contain transitionary provisions that allow employers to rely on collective agreement provisions for a certain period of time. The information I'm providing today is really tailored to non-unionized workplaces. So if you have unionized workers, you should really be seeking legal advice about how Bill 148 interacts with your specific collective agreement. And now a bit of an overview of some of the changes and when they are coming or have come into effect. So these are the changes that are now in effect. And these are some of the changes that are coming into effect on April 1st, 2018, and then January 1st, 2019. So these are changes that we're going to be reviewing today. So let's start off with some changes to the ESA that are currently in effect. So the minimum wage, you've probably all been hearing a lot about the increase to the minimum wage in the media. So we know that $14 an hour is now the minimum wage as of January 1st, 2018, and that the minimum wage is scheduled to increase to $15 an hour on January 1st, 2019, and with inflation each October 1st thereafter. Some things to note: there is no obligation to increase wages of employees who are already making $14 an hour or more. And employees do not need to sign new contracts in order to receive the minimum wage. Some other things to note is that most students under the age of 18 who work no more than 28 hours a week when school is in session, or who work during a school holiday, for example, March break or Christmas break, they're entitled to a student minimum wage, $13.15 an hour. But students who work more than 28 hours a week when school is in session are entitled to the general minimum wage of $14 an hour. A person employed as a student to instruct or supervise children and a person employed as a student at a camp for children are not entitled to a minimum wage under the ESA. So we had a lot of questions coming through the email line set up by ONN before today about students and how things apply to students. So it's really important to keep those rules in mind. So another change, public holiday pay now has a new calculation formula. And how the formula works is the regular wages earned in the pay period preceding the holiday are divided by the number of days worked in the pay period. So regular wages, for the purpose of this calculation, do not include things like overtime, public holiday pay, vacation pay, domestic or sexual violence pay, personal emergency leave pay, termination pay, severance pay, or termination of assignment pay. And all employees are entitled to public holiday pay as long as they work on the last scheduled day before the holiday and their first scheduled work day after the holiday, unless they couldn't for a reason beyond their control. So for example, if they were ill and they couldn't work. The last scheduled workday is not the last calendar day before the holiday. It's the last day that employee was scheduled to work. So for example, if the employee is on vacation or personal leave, emergency leave before the holiday, they're not deemed to have missed their last scheduled day. The employer would do the calculation using the pay period prior to the leave or vacation. So if the holiday falls on a day that would not ordinarily be a working day for the employee, we had a few questions about this, or a day when they're on vacation or personal emergency leave, most employees in this situation are entitled to a substitute day off with public holiday pay, unless the employer and employee agree electronically or in writing that the employee will be paid the public holiday pay for the holiday, but won't take a substitute day off. So they are entitled to a substitute day off with public holiday pay unless there's this other agreement in place. If you do give a worker a substitute day off, employers must provide written confirmation of what this substitute day is, and you should be keeping a record of this. A few practical points about public holiday pay. Employers should ensure their payroll calculation for public holiday pay is updated to reflect this new formula. And you should also make sure your bookkeepers or automatic payroll systems are also informed of the change. It doesn't matter if an employee works a set number of hours each week or pay period, the formula that you're using is the same as the one we just reviewed. This new formula now means that part-time workers will see a substantial increase to their public holiday pay. And I'm just going to go through an example to demonstrate what this looks like. So let's say we have Sharon and she works 1 day a week and her regular wages are $100 a day. Sharon worked her 2 scheduled work days in the 2-week period preceding New Year's Day 2018. So Sharon earned $200 in the preceding pay period for 2 days worked. $200 in regular pay divided by 2, so divided by the 2 days that she worked equals $100. So this means that Sharon will earn a full day's pay for the public holiday. So another change that's come into effect through Bill 148 is around the issue of misclassifying employees as independent contractors. So there have always been repercussions for this. So there have always been repercussions for misclassifying employees as independent contractors. And there continue to be repercussions outside of the employment standards regime for doing this. But now the ESA explicitly prohibits it and it gives the Ministry of Labor prosecution powers against employers who do not adhere. This is why it's really important for employers to have a grasp of the difference between independent contractors and employees. So distinguishing between employees and independent contractors is really fact specific. But here are some of the factors to consider when deciding how to classify someone. And please keep in mind that only some of these factors need to be true to fit an individual into one category or the other. You should also keep in mind that an individual can still be an employee even if they agree to be an independent contractor, they charge HST, they submit invoices, they use their own vehicle to carry out their work, and they don't have statutory deductions taken from their pay. If you decide someone is an independent contractor, they do not have rights under the ESA pertaining to things like minimum wage, limits on the number of hours they have to work, overtime pay, vacation pay, and public holiday pay, paid time off, or extra pay on public holiday pay, or extra pay on public holidays, pregnancy or parental leave, and other types of leaves where your job is protected, or a right to notice of termination or pay in lieu of notice if they are fired or laid off. An employer doesn't have to pay CPP or EI contributions for an independent contractor. So one practical thing to note is that you may want to start reviewing your jobs of those workers who you have as independent contractors to make sure that you've properly classified them. And you're going to want to look at what they're doing with these factors in mind, and keeping in mind that only some of these factors need to be true in order to fit a worker into an independent contractor category or an employee category. So personal emergency leave. We received a lot of questions from you about this, and I'm really hoping to clarify some things for you, but it is quite complicated, and I'll explain why. So what is the entitlement? 10 job protected days of leave for employees. And job protected means the employee goes off on a leave and you're required to hold their job for them until they come back. If employed 1 week or more, the first 2 days of leave are paid, the remaining 8 are unpaid. But if the employee happens to take the first 2 days of leave in their first week of employment, then the first 2 days they take after their first week of employment will be the paid days. The leave can be used for personal illness, injury, or medical emergency, or due to illness, injury, medical emergency, death, or urgent matter concerning certain family members. So we have 2 hyperlinks there for you, so you can learn a bit more about those 2 terms and what they mean here. So a few things to note. If an employee only takes part of the day off, an employer can count it as a full day of leave. You should also note that the definition of family member is broad, so you can go ahead and look at that link that I have there. And urgent matters need to be unplanned, beyond the employee's control, and have the potential to lead to serious consequences. So for example, an employee's babysitter calling in sick would be an urgent matter because it's unplanned, beyond the employee's control, and it has the potential to lead to a serious consequence if that child is left unsupervised. In terms of evidence that you can require, employers cannot require a medical note from a doctor, registered nurse, or psychologist if an employee is taking this leave. Employers can ask for a note from another health professional, so someone like a dentist or a physiotherapist. Employers can also require reasonable non-medical evidence like a death certificate or an obituary would be reasonable and relevant to someone, for example, taking leave in the case of someone's death. Some things to consider when trying to decide whether or not you're asking for reasonable non-medical evidence. What's reasonable will really depend on the specific situation, but you should consider why the employee needs the leave, how long the leave is, any past leave the employee has had or periods they've been away from work, whether the employee can get proof of what they need the leave for, and how much would it cost to get the proof. So who does personal emergency leave apply to? So it applies to all employers regardless of size. So personal emergency leave used to only apply to larger employers. It now applies to all employers regardless of size. It also applies to all employees regardless of full-time, part-time contract status, unless they are exempt from the ESA. So going back again to that first slide about the ESA and the industries and jobs that have special rules and exemptions. But also to keep in mind that when we say employee under the ESA, we're going back to the definition of employee under the ESA, which includes workers who work full-time, part-time, contract, casual, etc. So how is personal emergency leave different from sick days? I'm just waiting for the slide to turn. Thanks. Personal emergency leave and sick days. So we got a few questions about this, and the answer will really depend on your internal policies and rules surrounding the sick days you offer. But generally, these are the common differences. So personal emergency leave is required under the ESA. Sick days outside of personal emergency leave are not explicitly required under the ESA. An employer chooses to offer these. Personal emergency leave, there's 2 paid days if you're employed a week or more, and 8 days unpaid, whereas sick days are generally paid. For personal emergency leave, employers cannot require a medical note from a doctor, RN, or psychologist, whereas for sick days, outside of personal emergency leave days, can require a medical note from a doctor, RN, or psychologist. Personal emergency leave can be used for non-medical purposes, like we just discussed, urgent matters, and whereas sick days are usually only used for medical purposes. So if you offer sick days in your workplace, deciding which one of these applies in your workplace will really depend on what gives the employee a greater right or benefit. So what is this greater right or benefit rule? If an employment contract or collective agreement provides a greater right or benefit than what personal emergency leave requires, then the terms of the contract apply instead. But if the contract or collective agreement does not provide a greater right or benefit, then personal emergency leave applies to the employee. So a few practical thoughts on this. It's a very fact-specific analysis, and it will really depend on the internal policies of your workplace in relation to the sick days, bereavement days, or other leave days you provide in your contracts. Employers will want to review their policies relating to leave days to see if what they provide is a lesser or greater benefit than what personal emergency leave days require under the ESA. If the leave you provide entitles workers to a greater benefit, you do not have to provide personal emergency leave on top of what you already offer. But this is not just about the number of days that you provide. This is a qualitative and quantitative analysis of the basket of benefits offered in your contract compared to the basket of benefits required by the ESA under the personal emergency leave provisions. So you're going to want to look at the number of days you offer, whether they're job protected, how many are paid, what the days can be used for, and what's required in terms of evidence. If you are not sure about whether your contract provides a greater right or benefit, it's really best to seek legal advice, as this is a fact-specific analysis, and balancing the basket of benefits in your contract against the personal emergency leave entitlements is a difficult thing to do, and I cannot speak to each and every policy of every employer in this webinar. But I'm going to take you through a few case scenarios now that I'm hoping will demonstrate to you how this analysis is carried out, and also to demonstrate to you that this is not a black and white issue. This is not an issue that where there's always an easy answer. And so I'm going to read this case scenario, and then at the end of the case scenario, a poll is going to pop up on your screen. And you're going to have to select whether or not, yes, this is a greater benefit, no, this is not, or you're unsure. And you need to select one of the answers in order to move away from the polling screen. So this case scenario, you have a contract that provides an employee with 7 paid personal sick days and 5 paid bereavement leave days per calendar year. The policy says the sick days can only be used for personal illness and medical appointments, and that the bereavement days can only be used for bereavement. The contract does not require a medical note from a doctor, RN, or psychologist to access the sick days. Is this a greater right or benefit? So I'm going to give you a moment to select your answer on the poll.
Okay, and I'm just going to share some of the results as we continue along. We have 37% who said yes, and 46% who said no, and the remaining unsure.
Okay, so this poll really demonstrates that this is a really difficult concept, and it's a really difficult analysis to carry out. We basically had an even split between, or almost an even split between the no's and the yeses, and then a lot of unsures. And this is why it's so important when trying to figure this out for yourselves that you get legal advice. So there is no clear answer here. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Again, you have to weigh the basket of benefits offered in the contract against the personal emergency leave entitlement. So we know that these days, so I'm speaking about the case scenario, we know these days can only be used for personal illness, medical appointments, or bereavement, whereas personal emergency leave days can be used for other reasons. But this contract is offering more paid days than are offered under personal emergency leave, and there is no medical note required from a doctor, RN, or psychologist required. So using the greater right or benefit analysis, let's see how the sick days, bereavement days interact with personal emergency leave obligations under the ESA for a particular employee. So let's say an employee who works in this workplace, remember we're still in the case scenario workplace. So let's say an employee who works in this workplace takes 2 days off because the employee has appointments to meet with their child's counselor to discuss behavioral problems at school. And the appointment can't be scheduled outside the employee's working hours. The employer in this situation cannot then subtract these 2 days from the sick day or bereavement bank under the contract, because according to the policy, absences like these are not covered as paid days off. They're not, this absent has to do with her child and an appointment at school. It's not about illness and it's not about bereavement. So in this case, the contract does not, in this particular set of circumstances, this contract does not provide a greater right or benefit to this worker than what is provided under the Employment Standards Act. So the employee will be allowed to take these 2 days as personal emergency leave. Now let's say a different employee takes 3 days off for personal illness in a calendar year. The ESA does not prohibit our employer from counting those days against both the employment contract entitlement to sick days and against the employee's personal emergency leave entitlement. And this is because in terms of absences for illness, the contract provides the greater benefit because it's providing more paid days and it's not requiring the medical note from the doctor, registered nurse, or psychologist. So even though this is not prohibited by the ESA, an employment contract may speak to whether or not personal emergency leave days count against any contractual leave entitlements. So you may want to review your contracts to see if they speak to this and what they say. So another scenario, an employment contract provides a benefit plan that includes 13 days of paid leave for illness, bereavement, or any other reason each calendar year. The plan does not require any medical notes. Is this a greater right or benefit? So that poll is going to come up again, and let's see what we think about this scenario.
Okay, so about 3/4 of you have responded, and the answer is 81% yes, 5% no, and the rest unsure.
Great. Okay, so I am also leaning towards yes. So for those of you who said yes, I think you're on the right track. This was a bit more straightforward. The employer is giving the employee 13 days of paid leave for any reason, not requiring medical notes. This is a greater benefit. The employer does not need to provide personal emergency leave days on top of what their plan offers, because the contract entitlement will prevail if it is providing a greater right or benefit. So if an employee is absent for 3 days, let's say because of the death of a parent, and claims benefits under this plan, the employee is considered to have used 3 days under the plan because the plan has prevailed in this scenario. So let's do one more tricky one. The employer provides employees 10 paid sick days to be used for the employee or someone the employee is caring for. The employer has a policy of requiring a medical note from a doctor after an employee has been sick for 3 days to justify the further days off, so the days after the 3 days. An employee ends up being off sick for 10 days. Is this a greater right or benefit? And what you can start to think to yourself, what is the impact on this employee's entitlement? And we'll review that after the poll.
Okay, so we have about 35% yes, 40% no, and the remaining unsure maybe.
Okay, so we got a similar response to the first scenario as we did to this one. So again, this demonstrates how difficult this sort of analysis can be. So there is no clear answer here. You need to balance the factors to decide whether there's a greater right or benefit. So this employer, they're giving at least 10 days and they're all paid. So they are providing more paid days than personal emergency leave. But the employer requires a medical note from a doctor for any days beyond 3. And we're not really sure from this scenario whether or not these days can be used for things other than illness. So what's the impact on this employee's entitlement? I believe that you could argue that the first 3 days off can be offset against the personal emergency leave the employee is entitled to, as the employer didn't require any documentation for these first 3 days and the employer is offering all 3 days as paid. Any further days off, since the employer is requiring a doctor's note for them, one could argue is not a greater right or benefit than what's offered by personal emergency leave, even though they are paid. The employee in this situation might be able to take the additional days after the first 3 as unpaid personal emergency leave if they do not provide a note, because remember, they need a note to access the days under the contract. But if the opposite argument prevails and the contract entitlement is found to be the greater right or benefit for the employee, then the employee will have to provide a medical note to use the days under the contract. And these days, once taken, will be subtracted from their contract entitlement bank as if the benefit because the benefit under the contract has prevailed. So again, this demonstrates that this is a really fact-specific analysis under your specific contract. And if you're unsure, you should absolutely seek out legal advice. So very, very quickly, I'm going to go over some changes to pregnancy and parental leave. So pregnancy leave increased in the case of miscarriage or stillbirth. If an employee's leave begins on or after January 1st, 2018, they are now entitled to at least 12 weeks of leave after the miscarriage or stillbirth. I think before it was 6 weeks of leave. The new increases to parental leave can apply if the baby was born or came into the parent's custody and care on or after December 3rd, 2017. So this is an increase from 35 to 61 weeks for employees who take pregnancy leave, and an increase from 37 to 63 weeks for employees who do not take pregnancy leave. Employers may want to review their employment contracts and benefit plans, internal policies to make sure any top-up you offer meets the new obligations for extended leave. Employers may also want to take into consideration that planning for coverage while a worker is on extended parental leave may require different budgeting and advanced planning for contracts if an employer is hiring a replacement for that employee while they are on leave. If you'd like more information about changes to pregnancy and parental leave, you should visit the FAQ sheet on the ONN site. There's some new or change leaves to go through very, very quickly here. So a new leave is domestic or sexual violence leave. Employees are entitled to this if they have been employed for at least 13 weeks, they or their child have been the victim of domestic or sexual violence or experienced a threat of domestic or sexual violence, and the leave is taken for one of the prescribed reasons in the ESA. And you can see what those prescribed reasons are at that link or on the FAQ page on ONN's website. An employee who qualifies for this leave, they can take 10 days and up to 15 weeks each calendar year, and the first 5 days of the leave are paid. It's also important to note that employers do have certain obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in terms of internal policies related to domestic violence. And you can visit the FAQ page for more detail on that piece. Here's some other leaves. So there's the family caregiver leave, the family medical leave, and the critical illness leave. And I think we had a few questions about what the differences are between these three leaves. So I'm hoping to make that a bit clearer for you with this chart. It's important to note that employers are not obligated to pay for these leaves, but employees may be able to get EI benefits if they're caring for someone who is sick. So that's a separate process through EI and Service Canada. Critical illness leave that we have up there replaces what used to be called critically ill childcare leave. And you'll note that critical illness leave is for a family member, including someone who thinks of you as a family member or a child under 18 who's critically ill. If you want more information about these leaves, some of these terms and information about these leaves are on the FAQ sheet on ONN's site. And we also have information on the FAQ sheet about crime-related child disappearance leave and child death leave. So some changes to vacation and overtime. Full-time, part-time contract employees with a period of employment of at least 5 years are now entitled to 3 weeks of vacation and 6% vacation pay. So as of January 1st, 2018, regardless of when your entitlement year ends, if you have a worker with a period of employment of 5 years, they are, as of January 1st, 2018, entitled to 3 weeks of vacation and 6% vacation pay. Employers must record and keep a record for 5 years of various information related to vacation, and you can see what your record keeping requirements are at that link attached to the word here. You should be reviewing vacation entitlement to make sure that it's adjusted for any employees with 5 or more years in their period of employment. And you should be looking at your payroll systems as well, so this is adjusted without glitches. If you have a policy of paying out vacation pay on each paycheck, as some employers do, this rule about vacation pay that I just reviewed still applies, because the ESA is still giving employers options of how vacation pay is paid out. Overtime. Employees who are working overtime must be paid at the rate for the position they are working during the overtime period, even if the employee holds more than one position with the employer. And there are some record-keeping requirements for overtime as well, and they can be found at that same hyperlink on this page. And I think we have a bit more information about vacation and overtime on the FAQ sheet on ONN's site. So now we're going to look at some changes to the ESA that will come into effect April 1st, 2018. equal pay for equal work. An employer cannot pay their casual, part-time, temporary, and seasonal employees a different rate from their full-time employees if the employees perform substantially the same work. And we'll explore what that means in a moment. Employees are allowed to ask employers and coworkers about their rate of pay if they think they're not receiving equal wages to full-time employees. An employer cannot penalize or threaten to penalize employees inquiring or those who have disclosed their wages to determine equal pay. So what does substantially the same work mean? It's not necessarily identical. It's work that could be in the same job classification, but it does not need to be interchangeable. There should be similar working conditions. So these are things like exposure to the elements, health and safety hazards, workplace environment. It should also be the same establishment. And if you click on that hyperlink, you'll get a sense of what same establishment means. So a business with more than one location will be considered the same establishment if it meets certain circumstances. For example, the locations are in the same municipality. The work should require substantially the same skill. So this is referring to amount of knowledge and capability of the employee, effort, and this can be physical or mental, and responsibility, number and nature of the job obligations, degree of accountability, and degree of authority. So I have a case scenario here for you to consider. And again, at the end of the case scenario, we're going to have a poll. So Bob and Amer work for the same nonprofit employer as program managers, and they're paid an hourly rate. Bob works part-time and is responsible for managing the organization's programs in the East End of Toronto, while Amer works full-time and is responsible for managing the organization's programs in the West End of Toronto. The East End and West End programs are different, but they both work in similar offices, and there is nothing about either of these jobs that requires more skill, effort, or responsibility. So is this substantially the same work?
Okay, we have about 95% of you who say yes.
Okay, great. So yes, I would say that this is substantially the same work. They're in the same municipality, the same job classification or job title. They have similar working conditions, they're both in these offices. They have different programs and they have different focuses in their work, but they're using the same skill, effort, or responsibility. So now let's say Amer's programs shift their focus a bit and Bob's job stays the same. Amer starts doing quite a lot of frontline work with people who live on or near the streets. This requires him to be outside during the winter, even on days where it reaches -30. Also, Amer's participant numbers have increased significantly, and the employer has asked him to supervise a junior employee to assist him. Bob and Amer still have the same job title, and they're still both carrying out the employer's programming. Is this still substantially the same work?
%90 of you have said no.
Great. Okay, I also would say that the answer is likely no. Without the details of Bob's job, it's hard to say 100% for certain, but with the facts that I've given you, I would also say no. They now have different working conditions, so there's exposure to the elements. Amer's now out in -30. He might be on his feet a bit more. It may require more physical effort because of the type of programming he's doing, and mental effort because the participant numbers have gone up. And he has more responsibility. He's now supervising a junior employee. So there are some exceptions to the equal pay for equal work rule. Differential pay for substantially the same work can be justified by a seniority system, which is usually defined by numbers of years of service, a merit system that should be based on objective factors, a system that measures earnings by quantity or quality of production or any other factor other than sex or employment status. And employment status here means the number of hours regularly worked by the employees or a difference in the term of employment, including permanent, temporary, casual, or seasonal. So if you have two workers performing substantially the same work, one is a part-time worker, one is a full-time worker, they should be paid the same. You can't pay them differently just because one is full-time or one is part-time. Employers planning on relying on any of these exceptions should be able to point to a detailed written policy pertaining to the system that justifies the exception. The policy should have clear parameters, and the employers will have to apply the policy fairly and equally across all employees. Employers should keep a detailed record of their rationale and supporting documentation, including but not limited to things like job evaluations or pay grids. Systems must be established in advance of giving employees differentials in pay. So you can't just implement them now to justify the differences in pay you already have. Employers cannot reduce an employee's rate in order to comply, so you can't bring down the higher paid employee to meet the lower paid employee's rate. Employers may also want to review the pay of full-time, part-time, seasonal, casual, and temporary employees doing substantially the same work to ensure that they are in compliance with these equal pay for equal work changes. Sorry. All right. Now we're going to move on to a case scenario. So John works full-time in a position that is eliminated during a restructuring in the workplace. As a result, John is demoted into a full-time position, also held by Rosa, who works part-time. The employer allows John to keep the rate of pay he had in his eliminated position, even though this is a higher rate of pay than Rosa. Is this allowed under the equal pay for equal work provisions?
So for the interest of time, we have about 50 who say no, 30 who say yes, and the remaining unsure.
Okay, so I would say yes in this scenario, and this is why. The decision to pay John more, it's not based on sex or the employment status of these two workers. John's position was eliminated, his salary was red circled, and he was allowed to keep it when he was demoted. So this fits under the fourth exception that we reviewed in the previous slide, any other factor other than sex or employment status. So this is an example of a situation that would be allowable under that exception. So some changes to the ESA that are in effect January 1st. So there are scheduling changes, and we're going to be spending much more time on this in the next webinar. So please send in your questions before the next webinar if you have any questions to do with scheduling. But the gist of the changes are summarized here, and you can also visit the FAQ sheet on ONN's site for more details in the meantime. Even though this is a little less than a year away, you may want to start looking at your policies and payroll systems, making sure they'll be ready and in compliance with these changes, and also looking at your budgets for this in advance. Also, there are some exceptions to these rules, and if you think your workplace might fit into one of those exceptions, and we cover those on the FAQ sheet, it's best to seek legal advice, as again, this will be fact-specific analysis. So lastly, enforcement of the ESA. So you might be thinking, what will happen if I don't comply with these rules by the deadlines that are in effect? So the Ministry of Labor enforces the ESA, and this includes changes brought in by Bill 148. The province has said they're going to be hiring 175 more employment standards officers, and ESOs can investigate a workplace in response to an employee complaint. And employee complaints can be made for free online without a lawyer, or do proactive investigations. An ESO can visit the workplace without notice, and an employer is required to produce requested records and answer relevant questions. Bill 148 has increased the flexibility around monetary orders that an ESO can give. And the Ministry of Labor can also decide to initiate a prosecution in court for a violation of the ESA. And so we have more information about enforcement and non-compliance on the ONN fact sheet, as well as on that hyperlink on the screen. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Monina. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, Rebecca, for all this helpful information. As Rebecca mentioned, if you have questions about how these rules apply to your specific situation, we recommend that you seek legal advice directly. However, we've got a couple of final items that may be helpful for you and your organization. So please mark your calendars for our next Bill 148 webinar to be held on February 22nd at noon. More details about how to register will be sent in your follow-up email, and you'll find more details as well through ONN's social media channels. All of the content we covered here today and more is available on our frequently asked questions page that you'll see in the second bullet. And we encourage you all to visit this page for further updates and information about Bill 148. Again, if you still have questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Bill 148 at the onn.ca email address. I see that many of you have been sending in questions, so we appreciate that. But for those who still have outstanding ones, we will try to incorporate the relevant information in the next webinar. But if not there, then on our frequently asked questions page as well. For more information on ONN and our work, particular to Bill 148, we encourage you to visit our website's links that are available on the last slide. I want to thank again to United Way of Toronto and York Region for supporting ONN in our Bill 148 education. And I want to thank you all who joined us today. We hope that today's webinar has helped you better understand the legislation and how it relates to your work. This webinar is just one of the ways in which ONN supports Ontario's nonprofit sector, bringing the latest information and experts directly to you. If you'd like to get more information about membership and our work, please contact us.